My name is Obiageli, and I want to tell you something that took me 31 years to say out loud. I raised my mother. Not in the way that children sometimes say this as a mild exaggeration, as in, I was very responsible, I helped a lot, I was mature for my age. I mean it in the direct and literal sense. From the time I was approximately 9 years old, I was the functional adult in my own childhood. I managed what needed managing. I covered what needed covering. I protected the people in that house who needed protection, which was primarily my younger brother, Chike, and in a different and more complicated way, my mother herself. I want to tell you how this happened and what it cost and what it took for my mother to finally see it. Because the seeing, the moment she finally, fully, undeniably saw what I had been carrying and for how long, that moment changed both of us in ways I am still, even now, in the middle of understanding. My mother's name is Ngozi Nwosu, and she is a woman of tremendous warmth and tremendous inconsistency, and I love her with the specific complexity of someone who has spent 31 years loving a person who was not always able to be what they were supposed to be. She is not a bad person. I want to say this clearly at the beginning because the story I'm about to tell could easily be read as a story about a bad mother, and that is not what it is. It is a story about a woman who was carrying things she had not been taught how to carry, who had been given no tools for the weight she was under, who made decisions that cost her children in ways she did not fully see because she was too deep inside her own difficulty to have the perspective the view required. I understand this now. Understanding it took a long time and cost a great deal, but I understand it. When I was 9, my father left. Not dramatically. The details of how he left and why belong to my mother, and I will not share them here because they are hers. What I will tell you is that after he left, something in my mother that had been organized around his presence became disorganized. Not immediately. She held things together for a while, the way people do on adrenaline and necessity. But within a year, the holding together had started to show its cracks, and within 2 years, the cracks had become the main feature. She was sad in a way that could not always get out of bed in the morning. She was anxious in a way that filled the house with a low-level tension that Chike, who was 6, could feel but could not name. She forgot things, appointments, bills, Chike's school events, the particular small consistencies that make a child feel safe. Not always and not completely, but enough. Enough that someone needed to fill the gaps. I filled the gaps. I want to ask you something before I go further. If you grew up in a house where a parent was struggling with sadness, with anxiety, with illness, with anything that reduced their capacity to be fully present, what did you do? Did you step in? Did you become smaller to take up less room? Did you become larger to cover more ground? And did anyone ever ask you how that felt? Tell me in the comments because I think there are more of us than anyone talks about, children who became adults before they were supposed to, and I think the experience of being seen in that is rarer than it should be. Not because I had done anything wrong, because I had left. Because Chike was still there, 15 years old, and I had been the thing that made that house navigable for him, and now I was gone. Because my mother was still there, and the system of management I had built around her particular needs was now absent, and I did not know what would happen without it. I called home every few days for the first year of university, not because I was homesick, but because I was monitoring, still managing, still the functional adult, just from a distance. This is the part that I think is hardest for people who have not lived this to understand. The leaving does not end the role. The role is internalized by that point. It travels with you. It shows up in your adult relationships in specific ways, in the way you manage other people's emotions before attending to your own, in the way you read rooms and adjust before you have decided what you actually want, in the way you find it easier to be needed than to need, easier to be the stable one than to be the one who is falling apart. I did not understand any of this at 18. I understood it at 28 in a therapist's office when she asked me to describe my childhood, and I heard myself say, "It was fine. I was a responsible child. I helped my mother a lot." And she said, "How old were you when you started helping?" And I said, 9. And she said, "What kind of help?" And I told her. And she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Obiageli, that is not a child helping. That is a child parenting." I had never heard it said that way before. I sat with those words for a long time. The conversation with my mother happened when I was 31, not because I planned it, because something happened that made it impossible not to have. I had come home for a weekend visit, one of the regular ones I had maintained over the years, because I loved her, and because the habits of monitoring and managing and reading rooms do not disappear just because you understand them. We were in her kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, and she was telling me about a difficulty Chike was having at work, and she said, in passing, not as the main point of what she was saying, she said, "You know, you were always so strong, even as a child. I never worried about you the way I worried about Chike." I stood at that kitchen counter, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Not anger, something older and deeper than anger. The specific grief of a child who needed to be worried about and was not, because she had made herself appear not to need it. I said, "Mama, can I tell you something?" She said, "Of course." And I told her, not in anger and not in accusation, in the specific, careful voice of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and is finally, with great care, putting it somewhere outside themselves. I told her what 9 years old looked like from the inside. I told her about the mornings I woke Chike, and the bills I tracked, and the emotions I managed, and the room I was always reading, and the ordinary carelessness of childhood that I never had room to access. I told her about the guilt I felt leaving for university. I told her about the therapist's office at 28 and the words, "That is not a child helping, that is a child parenting." My mother listened. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. She listened the way you listen when you are hearing something that you knew somewhere underneath your knowing and are now being required to know it at the surface. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time. I want to stop here because what happened in that silence is the part of this story that I have thought about most, and I want to ask you something before I tell you what she said. If the person who was supposed to parent you, who was supposed to be the bigger one, the steady one, the one you could be frightened in front of, if that person finally saw fully and clearly what they had missed, what would you need them to say? What would be enough? What would begin to close the distance? Tell me in the comments, because I think different people need different things, and I think knowing what you need is part of the work. My mother said, "I did not know." She said it simply, not as a defense, as a statement of fact. She said, "I did not know, Obi. I thought you were fine because you seemed fine. I thought you were strong because you were strong. I did not understand that the seeming fine and the being strong were things you were doing for me. I thought they were just who you were." She looked at her hands on the kitchen table. She said, "I was so deep inside my own difficulty that I could not see outside it, and you were standing right outside it, holding everything, and I did not see you there." She looked up. She said, "I am sorry. Not for being sad. I could not help being sad. I am sorry for not seeing what it was costing you to manage around my sadness. I am sorry I did not ask. I am sorry you were 9 years old and responsible for things no 9-year-old should be responsible for. I am sorry I did not worry about you the way I worried about Chike. You deserved to be worried about. I sat at that kitchen table and I let my mother's words reach me. Not immediately. There's a version of yourself that has been managing for so long that being cared for requires adjustment, but I let them reach me, slowly, completely. And something that had been held tightly for a very long time began to loosen. I do not want to tell you that one conversation fixed everything. It did not. 22 years of internalized role does not dissolve in one Saturday afternoon in a kitchen. The habits of monitoring and managing and reading rooms are still present in me. They will probably always be present in some form. You do not unlearn the things you learned for survival. What changed was something smaller and more important than fixing. What changed was that she saw me. After 31 years, my mother saw me. Not the capable one, not the strong one, not the one she did not need to worry about. Me, the child who needed to be worried about and deserved it. The 9-year-old who woke her brother, tracked the bills, and managed the temperature of a house that was not her responsibility to manage. That seeing, the simple, complete, finally arrived seeing, was worth more than I can tell you. Not because it changed the past, because it changed what I was carrying in the present. When the person who was supposed to see you finally does, something releases, some weight that you didn't even know you were still holding because you had been holding it so long it had become part of the landscape of your body. Something of that weight lifts. God did not give me an easy childhood, but He gave me a mother who was eventually able to look at what that childhood had cost and say, I see it. I am sorry. You deserved better. That is not nothing. That, in fact, is everything.
She is described as the mightiest and fairest of all the elves that remained in Middle-earth. She has lived through the destruction of Valinor, the drowning of Beleriand, the rise and fall of Numenor, and 3 ages of unceasing war against the greatest evils the world has ever produced. She holds one of the 3 elven rings, and has used it for thousands of years to preserve the last living piece of the First Age inside a golden forest. And when the one ring is offered to her, when Frodo holds it out and essentially hands her the most powerful object in the history of the world, she refuses it. Today, on Riddles in the Dark, we tell the full story of Galadriel. Not the version from the films, and not the version from the Amazon series, the version Tolkien actually wrote. To understand Galadriel, you have to go back to Valinor. She was born in the Undying Lands, the eldest daughter of Finarfin, grandson of Finwë, the High King of the Noldor. From her very earliest days, she was recognized as exceptional, not just powerful, but wise in a specific way that made even the greatest of the Noldor take notice. Tolkien describes her as having a mind that combined the quality of a ring of adamant with the quality of deep water. Hard and clear-sighted on the surface, vast and unfathomable beneath. She was, in short, already one of the most formidable beings in Valinor before she ever set foot in Middle-earth, which makes what happened next all the more significant. When Feanor led the Noldor into exile, when the great host of elves abandoned Valinor to pursue Morgoth and recover the Silmarils, Galadriel went with them. Not because she followed Feanor. She had no love for Feanor and did not swear his oath. She went because she had her own reasons, her own ambitions. Tolkien is very clear about this in his later writings. Galadriel wanted to rule. Not in the way that Feanor wanted to rule, through domination and force, but she was proud and she was ambitious and she wanted her own realm, her own domain, a place where her gifts could find their full expression. Valinor, under the authority of the Valar, was not that place. Here's a question I want you to sit with. Is there a meaningful difference between Galadriel's desire for her own realm and the kind of pride that destroyed Feanor and Saruman? Tolkien spent decades wrestling with this question in his notes, changing his mind about Galadriel's motivations and the nature of her wisdom multiple times. Tell me what you think in the comments, because I think the answer matters enormously for how we understand her choice at the end. She crossed the Helicaxin, the grinding ice in the north, the terrible passage that the elves who refused Feanor's ships were forced to take. It killed many of them. The cold alone was enough to break lesser beings. Galadriel survived it and arrived in Middle-earth with the experience of having endured something that most elves could not have endured. She was, from the very beginning of her time in the mortal world, shaped by hardship in a way that her early life in Valinor could never have provided. In the First Age, she lived in Doriath for a time, where she learned from Melian the Maya, one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth, wife of King Thingol, whose supernatural power created the girdle of Melian that protected the realm. The things Galadriel learned from Melian about the nature of power and protection, and the relationship between strength and wisdom, would shape everything she did for the next several thousand years. She survived the First Age. She survived the War of Wrath. She survived the breaking of Beleriand. And then, in the Second Age, she came to a place in the west of Middle-earth with her husband Celeborn and established a realm. Not yet Lothlorien, that came later, but the beginning of what would become the greatest elven realm of the Third Age. Now, here is the part of Galadriel's story that most people know almost nothing about. In the early Second Age, she was given an opportunity that changed everything. Celebrimbor, the greatest elven smith since Feanor, Feanor's own grandson, was at work in Eregion crafting rings of power under the influence of a figure he knew as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. Galadriel did not trust Annatar. She said so directly. She refused to receive him in Lothlorien. She warned the elves of Eregion. They did not listen because Annatar was very persuasive, and Galadriel's warning came without a specific accusation. She could not prove who he was, only that something about him was wrong. Annatar was Sauron. When Sauron revealed himself and put on the One Ring to dominate the Rings of Power, Galadriel and the other two keepers of the three elven rings immediately removed them. They understood what had happened, and they did something extraordinary. They kept the rings hidden, unworn for the rest of the Second Age and most of the Third. They waited. Thousands of years of holding something of enormous power and not using it, because using it would have revealed its existence to Sauron, and Sauron would have been able to reach through it and corrupt whatever she built with it. Do you understand what kind of patience actually means? Not weeks or months or even decades, thousands of years of holding something of enormous power and not using it because the moment was not right. This is what Tolkien means when he describes Galadriel as wise. Not wise in the way of book learning, wise in the way of someone who has lived long enough to understand that power used at the wrong moment is worse than power not used at all. After Sauron was defeated at the end of the Second Age and his physical form was destroyed, Galadriel finally put on Nenya, and with it she created Lothlorien, the Golden Wood, the place where time moves differently, where the First Age is somehow still present, where the trees are Malorn trees from Valinor, and the light is the light of memory rather than the present. It is, in Tolkien's mythology, an act of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary sadness simultaneously, because Galadriel knows that Lothlorien is preserved against time, and she knows that time is the one thing she cannot ultimately defeat. Here is the thing about Nenya that most people miss. Its power is the power of preservation, not creation, not domination, preservation. Galadriel chose, of all the things she could have done with a ring of power, to use hers to keep something from being lost. There is an entire philosophy of power in that choice, and it stands in direct contrast to Sauron, whose ring was made for domination, and to Morgoth, whose impulse was always toward destruction. Galadriel looks at the world, and the first thing she asks is, "What can I save?" And then Frodo arrives with the One Ring. The scene in the Mirror of Galadriel is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of Tolkien. Frodo offers her the ring, and she is tempted. She admits it directly. She has thought about this, has imagined what she could do with it, has constructed an entire vision of herself as a ring lord. Tolkien describes what she might become with a kind of terrible beauty, great and terrible and dark, no longer a dark lady but a queen, beautiful and terrible as the dawn, treacherous as the sea. All shall love her and despair. She refuses, not because she is not tempted, because she understands what the temptation is. She passes the test precisely by acknowledging that she would fail it if she tried to pass it any other way. She will diminish, she says, and go into the west, and remain Galadriel. What do you think it cost her to say that? She has been in Middle-earth for 7,000 years. She crossed the grinding ice. She survived the First Age. She built Lothlorien. She has been waiting patiently for the right moment to use her full power for 7,000 years. And the right moment comes. The One Ring is in her hand, and she gives it back, because using it would have made her exactly the thing she has spent 7,000 years fighting against. This is Tolkien's answer to the question he raised with Galadriel at the very beginning. Is her ambition different from Feanor's? Is her desire for her own realm different from Saruman's? The answer, Tolkien suggests, is not in the desire itself. It is in what you do when the desire is tested. Feanor chose the Silmarils over everything else. Saruman chose power over wisdom. Galadriel chose to diminish.